Welcome back to another slider update video, the first update to my realistic slider set for FC25. Title Update 2 has dropped recently, and I'm actually recording this video on the day that the gameplay tuning update has dropped as well. So there has been some slight changes to the FC25 gameplay since release. However, they are simply slight changes. So today we'll be going over version 2 of my realistic slider set that features some slight tweaks, some slight improvements that should result in some more balanced, more realistic, more enjoyable gameplay. Now, I should just note the usual things before we get started. Firstly, the intention of my slider sets is to make the gameplay more realistic, not necessarily harder, not even necessarily more enjoyable, but more realistic. Secondly, for that reason, I recommend playing on 10-minute halves, on legendary difficulty, and with full manual controls. So the standard slider set that we go over today, these will be the recommended settings. However, I do also recognize that not everybody is necessarily going to want to play the game in that exact way. So as well as the standard set, we'll be going over 3 additional sets. A harder set of sliders for those who need a bit more of a challenge, an assisted set for those who don't want to play on full manual controls but prefer to use the assists. And then for the first time today, we'll be going over a shorter halves set for those who don't want to play on 10-minute halves but prefer something more in the 4 to 6 minute range. The final thing to note is that I'll only be going over the sliders today. If you want to see a breakdown of every setting and slider that you need to change to get FC25 playing realistically, check out my initial complete breakdown video. So firstly, there has not been a huge change to the movement sliders. We have lowered sprint speed for both the user and the CPU to 42. We still have acceleration at 48 for the user and at 46 for the CPU. So we are maintaining that discrepancy of 2, giving the user a slight bump to make up for the lack of alertness, especially defensively for the CPU, AI controlled players, but lowering the sprint speed slightly just to bring that game speed down since we don't have that option in the main menu this year. Shot error we have lowered by just 2 for the user, so this comes down to 48. I believe shot error is the same as in the initial set of 55 for the CPU, and I believe the same goes for the pass error as well. 5 for the user. Potentially we brought this down to for the CPU actually. I vaguely remember it being 52 in the initial set, but you want this set at 50 for the CPU. Shot speed as well, you've got some slight changes. 50 for the user, 34 for the CPU, as well as pass speed, 46 for the user and 38 for the CPU. So each of these previous sliders combine to give the overall speed of the game. It's ever so slightly quicker than I would like at this stage. I would prefer it to be slightly slower. However, there is a balance to strike with a lot of these values. You can't simply lower them until the players and the ball move at the speed that you would like it to move. Pass speed is a good example, especially for the user. If I was taking a purely aesthetic approach, I would probably lower this value even further to further slow down the speed at which the ball moves across the pitch and through the air. However, lower this value too much and it becomes too easy for the CPU defenders on the opposing team to intercept passes, especially on the ground whilst you're trying to build through the lines or play passes around in midfield. The same can be said for the sprint speed sliders as well. If I was going for a purely aesthetic approach, I would probably lower these even further. However, doing so does mean that it's far more difficult for your players to beat opponents in a one-on-one dribbling situation. It also makes things slightly difficult from time to time for your players to catch up to a long ball. If you play a long diagonal ball from left back to right wing, for example, with this value too low, the player can't get to the spot to meet that ball before it goes out of bounds. And of course, you can't lower the pass speed to make up for that for the reasons that I've already discussed. So it's very much a balancing act with these kind of sliders. And this gives you the best balance in terms of slowing the gameplay down, but keeping some realistic dynamic interactions on the field. The quest goes on for a good set of injury sliders. FIFA 23 and before, I feel like it was relatively easy to get a decent set of injury sliders, but with FC 24 came the arrival of the dreaded broken toe, and we are still just trying to find a set of values that avoid just getting broken toe injuries constantly. Currently, I'm on 78 for frequency and 17 for severity. We've got a slight bump to the user goalkeeper ability value. That's up to 78 Goalkeeper ability for the CPU has been lowered to 30. Marking remains at 60 for both the user and the CPU. 60 is still the most balanced value, I think, at this particular stage. However, the biggest change between version 1 and version 2 is going to be these run frequency values, which are both up at 75 for both the user and the CPU. This is a huge departure from previous editions of the game, where I would almost invariably lower these values down to something in the 20 to 25 range typically, but it's all the way up at 75. Tactics, player roles, just having such an impact on the game this year, preventing players from breaking forward and kind of breaking out almost of those quite restrictive player roles. You have to bump this value up incredibly high to facilitate those kind of attacking runs that players should be making ordinarily. These values are also going to pair with a slight adjustment to the CPU sliders, which we'll get to in just a little bit as well. The shape of the game remains, so as well as the marking, line height, length, and width remain the same for both the user and the CPU. So 35 in terms of line height, 40 for the length, and then 45 for the width. Fullback positioning also remains the same from version 1 and from previous editions of the game, to be honest. So 25 for the user, just default 50 for the CPU. Power bar, personal preference, I like it at 62. And then the other big change for this particular edition is going to be first touch control error at 5 for both the user and the CPU. In version 1 of this slider set, I advocated a big disparity between these values. We had the user at 5, but we had the CPU all the way up at 99. And I spoke in that initial video about how much this slider affects. It doesn't just affect the first touch control error. And in fact, it barely affects the first touch control error, to be honest. It affects so much more beyond. The success of tackles, particularly shoulder tackles, where the ball ends up, whether it ends up with the CPU or the user team after lucky deflections, rebounds, that kind of thing. Even things like close control when dribbling. And you simply don't need the disparity this year. So initially I brought this back to 50-50 for both the user and the CPU. Close control on dribbling just wasn't there at the value of 50. So I ended up dropping both of the values down to 5. So this levels the playing field for both the user and the CPU team, but also allows them to maintain a bit of strength and dynamism on the ball, particularly in close control situations. Now, as for the CPU sliders, I've made some slight adjustments to the custom set that I recommended in version 1. I do continue to recommend the custom set over tactical or over dynamic. However, I think it might be interesting to kind of create a hybrid between custom and something like dynamic. So let's just go over the values first of all. Tackle aggression remains at 99. Build-up speed, however, has been brought back to 50. So this is what's going to pair with the run frequency sliders. In version 1, we had lower run frequency values, but a higher build-up speed. But the effect that had was that because of the higher build-up speed, the CPU would get the ball forward quickly. But because of the lower run frequency values, the players wouldn't necessarily follow the ball up the pitch quite as quickly. So you would end up with 1 or 2 attackers being isolated in the final third. Your defenders would outnumber them, and you would dispossess the CPU team relatively easily. So we have almost reversed those values. We've lowered the build-up speed, so the CPU team will take a little longer to build up. They'll play through midfield. They'll play across the back 4 or back 5 a little more often. But we have those much higher run frequency values, which means players are getting forward. So as the CPU are building up, they can gradually progress up the field as they build up. That way you end up with players in forward positions in the opposition half, in the opposition final third. The ball not lagging behind exactly, but coming closely behind. And you have a variety of CPU options, both centrally and out wide, to take advantage of. Your defenders are no longer just completely outnumbering just a handful of CPU attackers. Shot frequency has been lowered ever so slightly to 68 at values like 70, I believe even 75 we had in the initial version 1. CPU teams were just taking too many shots from outside the box. They would create a good opportunity. They would have numbers in and around the penalty area, but they would take a shot on far too easily, and again, just give you the ball back too easily. First touch pass frequency at 55 is a good value. Crossing is at 70. This one has gone back and forth. It's been at 75. It's been down as low as 65 and maybe even 60, but 70 is a good balance. Dribble frequency is currently on 55 with skill move frequency at 50. You do want players to take on your defenders in one-on-one situations when appropriate. You don't want to encourage that happening too often. You do want players to pass first, dribble when the opportunity arises and when it's an appropriate situation to do so. 55 and 50 has been the best balance I think I've struck at facilitating that so far. So these sliders can be input directly as they are, and it does give a really good balance, good variety of attacks from the CPU. They'll attack down the wings, they will dribble, they will cross, they will shoot from outside the box, they will play through the lines, they will, slip the ball through for runners in behind. Teams do also still approach the games differently, even though these may be static values. Tactics still have an impact. Player roles still have an impact. So it's not as if every team is going to play exactly the same way just because of these static values. I do find individual games go through ebbs and flows as well, with either team kind of dominating possession for periods before relinquishing that possession to the other team. With the build-up speed and the run frequency where they are as well, there can be periods where it is very much a possession game, where possession is turning over in midfield often. If one team creates an opportunity at one end, though, commits players forward, they're then exposed to a counter-attack, and then you can get a kind of back and forth, end-to-end period of the game. Is very fluid. It fluctuates very much in terms of the approach and the dynamic and the feel of what's going on at the pitch, not only from a game-to-game basis, but also within the game itself. However, if you do want even more differentiation between the teams, what I think might be interesting to try is not setting an individual value for each of these, but setting a value range and changing these values manually from game to game, just as they change from game to game on something like dynamic. So if you do want to try that, these would be the value ranges that I recommend. Tackle aggression, I just would always set at 99, but build up speed, I think you could really go anywhere from 35 to 55 and have a playable game. Shot frequency, 65 to 70. First touch pass frequency, 50 to 60. Crossing, 65 to 75. Dribble frequency, 50 to 60. And then skill move frequency, 50 to 55. Now that does, of course, mean you'll have to randomize and input these values in the main menu before every game. But if you do want even more differentiation, if you like the fact that, for example, tactical changes the values from game to game, but you don't want to risk build-up speed being set to 1, for example, then that is a way that you can kind of create a hybrid between some custom values that you know are going to produce a good, playable, realistic game, and something like tactical where you get a bit more variation and differentiation on a game-to-game basis. So here is the standard version 2.0 in its entirety. I will, as usual, put all of these values in the description below, but feel free to pause the video and input them into your game. Again, these are designed for use on legendary difficulty with 10-minute halves and on full manual controls. However, you may not want to play with full manual controls. You may not want to play with 10-minute halves. So as I said, I've got a handful of other sets for you, starting with the hardest set. So if you like playing on 10-minute halves, you like playing with full manual controls, but you find the standard set a little bit too easy, this harder version will give you a bit more of a tough test. There's going to be some slight differences in terms of the error values. The acceleration for the CPU does match the user at 48, so you don't get that slight advantage. Pass speed and shot speed for the CPU have been increased slightly here as well. The marking has been increased to 70 for each of the user and the CPU. And the first touch control error, you actually give the advantage to the CPU this time. So it's going to be the user at 50 in terms of the error value and the CPU down at 5. So that should make the game a little bit more difficult for those of you who need a bit more of a test. For those of you that don't want to use full manual controls and would prefer to play with the assists on, this next set is for you. So of course the big changes here are going to be the error values, 55 and 90 in terms of shot error and pass error for the user. The shot and pass speed values have been adjusted slightly as well. And then the first touch control error in this particular set for both teams is going to be set at 50. And finally, for those of you that don't want to play 10-minute halves and prefer something in the 4 to 6 minute range, for the first time ever, I do have a set for you as well. So a big discrepancy on the shorter halves version is obviously going to be the run frequency. You have less time to work with when you're playing shorter halves, of course. So you do need to facilitate more runs forward, more chances on goal. For that reason, the marking for both the user and the CPU has also been lowered to 50 apiece. And again, there are some slight variations in terms of the error, the speed values, the goalkeeper ability, and that kind of thing. However, I would also recommend some slightly different CPU sliders if you are playing on shorter halves as well. So for 4 to 6 minute halves, I would go with tackle aggression at 99, build up speed all the way at 70 though, shot frequency at 70, first touch pass at 55, crossing at 70, dribble at 65, and then skill move frequency again at 50. So there you have it, version 2 of my realistic slider set. I think this set has resulted in some really realistic, really dynamic, really enjoyable games on FC25. I think version 1 was good. I think the gameplay in general on FC25 is really good. I do feel like this set is an improvement. If you do want to see these sliders in action, make sure you check out my realistic Crystal Palace career mode featuring ChatGPT. I do use these sliders in games in that series. And of course, if you're not already subscribed but you do want to keep up with future updates to these sliders, they will be updated throughout the course of the year through every title update that EA drops, and in between if the gameplay does need adjusting slightly. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. But that'll do it for this one. I hope to see you in the next one. Take it easy.